In the next section, we'll talk about worms. And worms are very diverse and widespread. And worms are not just one phylum. As you can see here, we will cover several phylums, including Platyhelminthes, or the flatworms, Nemertea, ribbon worms, chaetonaths, annelids, and so on. So there's several, as you can see here on this phylogenetic tree, we have worms in lots of different phylums. So now we're getting bigger. As animals get larger and more complicated, they need organs and coordinated systems to digest their foods, circulate fluids like blood, excrete their waste, receive environmental stimuli, and coordinate their movement and other activities. They still have the ectoderm and endoderm cell layers, but now there's a third layer called the mesoderm, which develops into muscles. And movement has been more directed, so many have an anterior end, which is the head, and a posterior end, which is the back end. Often they'll have sense organs, and they're posterior, and most of them are bilaterally symmetrical. So the first group we'll look at are the Platyhelminthes, or flatworms. And flatworms come in lots of different colors, and they're often quite beautiful. And some of the features of flatworms are that they are bilaterally symmetrical. So remember before we talked about that, where you can only cut them in half in one spot, just like most animals. They don't have segmentation like some of the other worms have. And they have an incomplete or no digestive tract. And they respire through their body surface. So instead of having gills or something, they can just respire right through their body surface. And that's partially why they are so flat. They don't have any coelom, which is a body cavity, or a circular system. They move with cilia, which are little hairs that can help them move, also muscles and mucus. And they do have a very simple nervous system. So here's a diagram of the anatomy, and you can see that they have a brain, and they have this nerve cord and nerve network. So they have a lot of nerves that go throughout their body. Now, if you look at the picture on the right, you can see that a lot of their body deals with reproduction. So they are hermaphrodites, meaning that they are both male and female at the same time. So you can see they have ovaries and testes. And here is a flatworm swimming. So this is what they look like when they're swimming around. Please excuse my not so great video skills. As you can see, they're very flat. So we're just going to take a look at some cool looking flatworms here. These are flatworms, and as I said, they're often quite colorful and beautiful. Here's another one. Here's another one. I'm just going to show you all these pictures. I don't know the names of all of these. And this is from your book, and this is the famous penis fencing. So if you want to look up more about this, you can. But basically what it is that because they're hermaphrodites, they have both male and female organs. And so they both have a penis, and whichever one can stab, and they don't have an opening that they mate through, so they just stab their penis into the other worm, and fertilize their eggs. So whichever one gets stabbed with the penis ends up being the one to have the babies. And the next group are the phylum, the annelids or segmented worms. So phylum Annelida. And there are about 17,000 species in this group, and there are three major classes: the earthworms, leeches, and polychaetes. And the polychaete means mini setae, which are little hair-like things that they have on their legs. And most of them are marine forms, and there are about 6,000 species of these. There are also several subgroups of these worms. So the features of these worms is that they are segmented, and that is your textbook's distinguishing feature of this group is segmentation. They are mostly benthic, and they are bilaterally symmetrical, and they have complete organ systems. They have parapodia, which are like feet or legs, with bristles or setae and gills on each segment. And we'll see some pictures of what those look like. And they reproduce sexually, and many of them are hermaphroditic. So this is a bearded fireworm, which is one of the segmented worms. Now a little bit more about polychaetes. Polychaete worms include marine annelids and bearded worms, and many of them build tubes or burrow into the bottom. And they are important in sediment conditioning. So a lot of the sediments in the bottom have these worm tubes in them, and then that helps to break the sediment apart and keep it so that it's not, so it doesn't get all hard. They are mostly suspension or deposit feeders. So suspension feeders we talked about before. They are things that eat food that's in suspension. So mostly plankton, but also some dissolved organic matter. And deposit feeders are things that crawl along the bottom, and they eat the deposits in the bottom, which is usually like sand or silt. They take that in, and then their body can extract any nutrition that's in there, like any little microorganisms, and then they just poop out the sand. They have a planktonic stage that's called a trochophore, and so this is a part of the plankton that it's a very distinguishable plankton that we see, and we can tell when we see this one what it is. And it has this row of cilia around it, and then a tuft at the top. And it has a mouth and an anus, so it has a complete digestive system. And some of them live commensal with sea stars and hermit crabs. Commensal means they live together in a symbiotic relationship. This is a diagram of the sandworm, which is a polychaete worm, and you can see these are these setae, the little hairs that are on something that's like a foot. Here are the segments, so you have all the segments, and you have eyes, and then here you have the jaws and teeth and a mouth back here. And if you take a look at a cross section on the inside, you can see they have the coelom, which is the inside cavity, and then they also have an intestine and in their as their digestive tract. They have a nerve cord running through them and central blood vessel. So these are getting to be a lot more complex than the animals we've looked at so far. So this is like a cross section right here that you're looking at. And this right here is the head that you're seeing there. They kind of remind me of a centipede. And here's a picture of one. Here's another one. So those are all those hairs are like the setae. And many of these are fireworms. They have these little bristles can sting you if you were to touch them. So they often live under rocks in the tide pools or under the sand. If you find one, better not to pick it up because it can kind of sting you. It's not like a really bad sting, but it kind of feels like fiberglass in your skin if you've ever felt that before. This is a spaghetti worm, and this is one of the worms that lives in a tube. So over here in the middle, there's a tube that the main part of the worm lives in, that it burrows down into the reef. And then it has these long pieces that look like spaghetti that go out on the reef, and they just leave them out there so that little bits of detritus and little bits of food will stick to them, and then they bring them down into the mouth. So this is one of the tube-dwelling worms. And this is another tube-dwelling worm called the Christmas tree worm. It's also a segmented worm. And this one, they come in all different colors, and there's always two Christmas trees coming out of each hole. And then there's this little section right here that comes up that it has a spike on it. I can't see the spike on any of these. Well, maybe right here. It's like a sharp spike, and they live symbiotically with corals, usually the lobe corals. And what a lot of people think is that they actually help protect the corals against some of the coral predators because of that sharp spike. And they can, here's a close-up of one, so you can see it has the two things that look like Christmas trees that come out. Those are their gills, and they can use those to breathe and also to capture food that they can bring down inside. And if you ever saw that movie Avatar, at the very beginning of the movie, they were walking around in this jungle of things that would go down really fast. They would just suck down inside. And these were inspired by Christmas tree worms. They actually looked exactly like Christmas tree worms. And that's what they do. If you go up to one and put your finger by it, it will just go right down inside. And this is a feather duster worm, very similar to the Christmas tree worm. They live in a tube. The main part of it lives in a tube, and these are their gills that are sticking out. And here's a feather duster worm from the side, so you can see how it looks from the side. It's different than the Christmas tree worm because the Christmas tree worm went around in a spiral, and this one comes straight out. But very similar. And you can see that tube that they build to live in. And here's some other ones that just have, and you can see each one of these little tubes. So sometimes they're kind of in a colony like this. And sometimes you'll see in sand or mud, you'll see all these tubes sticking up. And those are the tubes of worms that live in tubes. There are also some really deep sea worms called Pogonophora beard worms. These are also called beard worms. And these are in the very deep sea at the vents in the mid-ocean ridge and the deep sea vents. And we will be talking about the deep sea later. But these are very interesting in that they have chemosynthetic bacteria that live symbiotically with them. Wow, that's a lot of words. Well, what that means is instead of photosynthesis, which happens at the surface in the sunlight, where it's deep and dark, they have bacteria that performs chemosynthesis, which can take sulfur from these vents and convert it into things that the worms can use. So we'll be talking about that more later when we talk about the deep sea animals. And here's kind of what a tube worm looks like. You can see when the worms are retracted, they're inside their tube, and then they can put their tentacles up outside the tube. The next phylum is phylum Sipuncula, and these are the peanut worms. And the peanut worms have about 320 species, and the textbook's distinguishing feature for these are their long retractable anterior end. So remember, the anterior end is the end with the mouth, the head. So that's right here. This is the anterior end as opposed to the posterior end. So it has this long retractable end. These are all marine. There are none in freshwater, and they live on the bottom. They're benthic, and they are unsegmented, but they have a true coelom. So they have a true body cavity. The next phylum, Echuria, are the spoon worms, and this one is called a fat innkeeper worm because he burrows down into the sand and makes like an inn, and other animals will live in this inn that he builds. So for these, there's about 135 species, and the textbook's distinguishing feature on these is that they have a non-retractable proboscis. So they bury themselves in mud or coral, and they are deposit feeders. So we talked about that before. Deposit feeders just crawl through, so that as they crawl through the mud, they eat it as they crawl through, and then they deposit the waste out the other end. So here you can see a fat innkeeper worm diagram, and here it is living in its hole that it made. And it has guests. It has a crab and some shrimp, and sometimes other kinds of worms will live in there, and ghost shrimp, all kinds of things will go and live in there. There's a lot of other kinds of animals that live under the sand too. The next phylum is the Nemertea, the ribbon worms, and these worms look like rubber bands. There are about 750 species, and they have a very long proboscis that they can use for capturing food. And the textbook's distinguishing feature for these is that they're long proboscis. They're mostly benthic. They are bilaterally symmetrical and not segmented. They have a complete digestive tract, which means they eat in one end and it comes out the other end as waste. And they contain toxins and spines. They respire through their body surface, so they don't have gills, and they have a closed circulatory system. Next, we'll look at the roundworms, and there are at least 15,000 species, and there may be up to 500,000. They're still being discovered all the time. And the textbook's distinguishing feature on these is that they're round in cross-section. They are mostly benthic, and they especially live in sediment, so down in the ground. So even earthworms are roundworms, so they live down in the earth. They are also commonly parasites, and they can be parasitic in many different organisms, and their larvae are often in fish muscle. They have small cylindrical pointed at each end. And they have a hydrostatic skeleton, which means they use water to push through to move back and forth. And they have a pseudocoelom, so it's not a true coelom. Next is phylum Phoronida, or the Phoronids, and for these there are 15 species, and they are all marine. And they are sessile, which means they live on the bottom. They are worm-like forms, and they live in chitinous tubes that are buried in the sand. And sometimes they're attached to rocks, shells, or other objects in shallow water. They're filter feeders with primitive low lophophore, and that is this horseshoe-shaped organ right here. That's the lophophore, and that's how they capture their food. Next is the phylum Chaetonatha and the chaetonaths or arrowworms. And there's about 100 species of these, and your textbook's distinguishing feature on these is that they're transparent with fins. So you can see these fins here. They are all marine, and they are planktonic, and they're carnivorous. So they are voracious eaters of small plankton and even small larval fish and things like that. And you can see here they have eyes and spines. They have a mouth. They even have a brain, and they have an intestine and an anus. So that's a complete body, complete digestive tract. Then finally, and there are more kinds of worms. We're just not going to cover everything, but these are called acorn worms, and there's about 85 species of these. They're usually between about 3 to 18 inches long. Some can reach 8 feet long. They share some of the same features with chordates and an echinoderm. So chordates are animals with a spinal cord, which are normally not invertebrates, and also the echinoderms, which are the sea stars. They are deposit feeders, so they crawl through the sand, eating the sand and what's in there. They can be either free living or live in U-shaped tubes, and some of them live around the hydrothermal vents. So that's just a short tour of worms. And here's a beautiful blue Christmas tree worm to leave you with. I really like Christmas tree worms because you find them all over the reef, and they come in all different colors, and they're really pretty, and it's fun to swim up by them and get a good look at their spiral gills that you can see sticking out. Until next time, a hui ho.